Russell, 1872 to 1970. Bertrand Russell had a long life, and he devoted himself to far more than just logic and philosophy, twice standing for Parliament in support of votes for women, and both in the First World War and in the last 2 decades of his life, campaigning for peace and disarmament. He wrote both technical and popular books, founded and for a time ran a school, was a columnist for an American newspaper for several years, and won the Nobel Prize for Literature. His was an amazing, active, and vigorous life, lived in championship of liberally progressive causes always, and made sparkling by the wit, clarity, and incisiveness of his mind. It was also and therefore a life of controversy. Trinity College at Cambridge took away his job to punish him for his opposition to the First World War, and his anti-war activities resulted in prison terms both then and again in the last decade of his life, on this latter occasion for his opposition to nuclear weapons. Earlier in his life, he campaigned for sensible views about divorce and sex education. Later in life, he campaigned against the Vietnam War. Indeed, the older he grew, the more radical he became. Early in life, he was and cheerfully described himself as having been a prig, an outlook inherited from the austerely moralistic grandmother who brought him up, Countess Russell, widow of the former Prime Minister Earl Russell. Experience liberated his attitudes. He married several times, and one of his more controversial books, Marriage and Morals, both lost him a job in New York as the result of a campaign by outraged moralists, nearly leaving him destitute, and 15 years later won him the Nobel Prize. When he was awarded the Order of Merit, which is the highest possible distinction in the British honor system, King George VI said to him at the award ceremony, quote, "You have sometimes behaved in a manner that would not do if generally adopted," end quote, to which Russell replied that what one does depends upon what one is. Consider, he said, the difference between a postman and a mischievous small boy ringing every doorbell in the street. The king did not know what to reply. The founding impulse Russell gave to analytic philosophy was aided by his younger contemporary at Cambridge, G.E. Moore. Indeed, Russell, always generous in his praise of others, said Moore gave him the first push towards abandoning the Hegelian idealism he had espoused as a student. But the ground for his doing was already fertile. When he first arrived at Cambridge, Russell was a disciple of his secular godfather, John Stuart Mill, though he disagreed with Mill's account of mathematics. His first philosophical book, published 10 years later, was a study of Leibniz. In it he wrote, quote, that all sound philosophy should begin with an analysis of propositions. Is a truth too evident, perhaps, to demand a proof, end quote. But in between, under the influence of the philosophy at Cambridge, he became a neo-Hegelian. McTaggart persuaded him to an unfavorable view of empiricism, and G.F. Stout persuaded him to believe in the absolute. He decided that understanding the nature of the absolute could and should be achieved from the perspective of science, and he decided to undertake a highly ambitious project to write something similar to Hegel's Encyclopedia of the Sciences. But using the advanced scientific knowledge available in the 1890s, he made his plan while residing in Berlin in 1895. The concept was Hegelian, but despite Bradley's strictures against piecemeal investigations, which he argued always led to contradictions, Russell made use of Kant's technique of transcendental arguments. A transcendental argument is one that takes something X accepted as being the case and examines what must also be the case as a condition for X to be the case. It is an argument that works backwards, so to speak, to the necessary conditions of X. A trivial example would be, you are reading these words, so we can know that it is true that you were born and have survived so far, since you could not be reading these words otherwise. So Russell made use of Kant's technique of transcendental arguments to examine particular aspects of experience and reality, aiming by this means eventually to construct a single comprehensive account of the absolute. He started with geometry and then arithmetic, and soon found the project running into difficulties. This is because the theory of relations necessary to support an absolute idealist thesis is unsustainable. One cannot make sense of there being differences between spatial points or between numbers unless one accepts that there are asymmetrical and external relations. Russell had been trying to write a paper, perhaps a book speakingly called An Analysis of Mathematical Reasoning. Parts of it survived into his first major philosophical work, The Principles of Mathematics, in 1903, in which he was trying to overcome the contradictions, prompting implications of the doctrine of internal relations. When he saw that this could not be done, he turned the argument on its head and used the contradictions as a reductio of the doctrine instead. A significant prompt for his doing was his encounter with G.E. Moore. Moore arrived at Cambridge 2 years after Russell, almost wholly ignorant of philosophy and quietly aiming for a life as a schoolmaster teaching classics to sixth formers. As he put it himself, at Cambridge he heard McTaggart and others lecture and decided to devote the second half of his degree to philosophy. He was taught by McTaggart, who he admired, and as a result he also became a neo-Hegelian, but only for a while. He soon yielded to a sense of amazement at some of the things asserted in philosophy, and in particular came to think that McTaggart's claims about the unreality of time were not just absurd, but perfectly monstrous. He said that although most philosophers claimed to be motivated by a sense of wonder at the universe, his own inspiration was quite different. It was a sense of wonder that such silly things could be said by philosophers. The net result of discussions between Russell and Moore was that they rejected neo-Hegelianism's key doctrines of monism and idealism in preference for pluralism and realism. During this process, they became committed to the idea that the right method in philosophy is the analysis of judgments or propositions, which, in Moore's view, exist independently of acts of judging them, and which consist of complexes of concepts. Moore's thinking in the period between the mid-1890s and the beginning of the 20th century led him to write his chief philosophical work, the Principia Ethica. In the same period, Russell was working on ideas that eventually led to the immense project, which he wrote in collaboration with Alfred North Whitehead, of the Principia Mathematica. As suggested by the starting point of his grand scheme for an absolute idealist encyclopedia of all sciences, mathematics lay at the center of his philosophical interests. It was one of his reasons for writing about Leibniz, whose metaphysics was significantly influenced by his mathematical and logical ideas. Leibniz had imagined a characteristica universalis, a perfectly clear and ordered language in which mathematics, science, and metaphysics can be expressed without ambiguity, and in which problems could be solved by calculation, thus overcoming disagreement. This idea was to inspire Russell's belief that logic can be just such a language. It shaped an inspiration on the part of many of those influenced by Russell and Freya that the logical analysis of language would be the royal road to solving the fundamental problems of philosophy. In the second half of the 1890s, Russell produced a series of intensive studies. His fellowship dissertation on the foundations of geometry in 1897, an analysis of mathematical reasoning sometime between 1897 and 1899, an unpublished manuscript entitled Fundamental Ideas and Axioms of Mathematics in 1899, an unpublished draft of the Principles of Mathematics, 1899 to 1900, his book on Leibniz in 1900, and then the Principles of Mathematics itself in 1903. He had also written a book about Marxism in Germany, German Social Democracy, published in 1896. When work was underway thereafter for Principia Mathematica, it generated important philosophical spin-offs, including the paper on denoting and the Mind Journal in 1905, containing the celebrated theory of descriptions described above and the germs of ideas Russell later developed about space, time, and matter as logical constructions. The development of Russell's ideas in the years leading to the Principles of Mathematics had convinced him that pure mathematics, arithmetic, analysis, and geometry, rests on logic. All pure mathematics deals exclusively with concepts definable in terms of a very small number of fundamental logical concepts, and all its propositions are deducible from a very small number of fundamental logical principles. And this quote is from Russell himself. This idea that mathematics is reducible to logic is known as logicism, and the inspiration for it was the powerful new development in logic in the 19th century. A major such development was Freya's revolutionary work, including his treatment of pontification, explained and applied, and of the ideas prompted in association with it, which Freya applied to his own attempt to derive arithmetic from logic. Russell learned of Freya's work from Peano at an International Congress of Mathematics held in Paris in 1900, and adapted some aspects of it to his own logicist project. Logicism motivated by the desire to solve two large puzzles about mathematics, one epistemological, the other metaphysical. The epistemological puzzle is, what justifies us in claiming to know mathematical truths such as 1 + 1 = 2? The metaphysical puzzle is, What are the entities or objects referred to in mathematics? The puzzles connect. We would be justified in claiming to know that 1 plus 1 equals 2 only if we know that 1 and 2 are together with how we understand plus and equal. These puzzles had not been put to rest by Kant's treatment of mathematical truths as synthetic a priori, based on the forms of sensibility which organize intuition or sense experience spatially and temporally, thereby underwriting geometry and arithmetic respectively. The first suggestion that mathematics is analytic as opposed to synthetic is attributed to Richard D. Dekind, who, like Freya, was influenced by the trends towards arithmetization in certain branches of mathematics, premising the idea that the foundations of arithmetic and analysis, a part of mathematics developed from calculus, are purely conceptual. Freya continued to believe that geometry was synthetic a priori, but held that arithmetic has a completely different basis. Dekind likewise had argued that geometric intuitions should have no place in thinking about a scientific basis for arithmetic. When Freya developed his concept script, it was with the aim of basing arithmetic on general logical laws and definitions, establishing that the truths of arithmetic are analytic. Russell himself had a long-standing desire to see mathematics placed on unassailable foundations. When he was a boy, his elder brother, Frank, taught him geometry, and when he questioned the starting points for it, the definitions and axioms, his brother said he just had to accept them, otherwise they would not go on. Russell was delighted by the beauty of Euclid, indeed by the whole realm of mathematics, but was troubled by the fact that it rested on foundations that had to be taken on trust. The prospect of showing that mathematics rests on logic was a deeply attractive one, therefore. It was on the last day of the 19th century, the 31st of December, 1900, that Russell completed the first draft of his Principles of Mathematics. People everywhere mistakenly thought the 20th century ended on the 31st of December, 1999, because there was no year zero. The first year of the Common Era being 1 CE, it follows that the last year of any century ends in 0. Thus, the last year of the 19th century is 1900. And the last year of the 20th century is 2000. The 21st century began on the 1st of January, 2001. Just 5 months later, he discovered a paradox which threatened the whole enterprise, and which when he communicated it to Freya in a letter the following year, caused Freya to abandon logicism in despair. Freya wrote back to Russell, "Your discovery of the contradiction has surprised me beyond words and left me thunderstruck because it has rocked the ground on which I meant to build arithmetic. It is all the more serious because it seems to undermine the only possible foundations of arithmetic as such." Freya not long afterward gave up his efforts, but Russell continued, struggling to find ways around the problem, eventually unsuccessfully also. The tale of Russell's project and the devastating paradox is, in summary terms, this. First, note the intuitive idea of a collection or a set of class of things, a collection of teacups on a tray, a collection of cows in a herd. Freya, and after him, Russell sought to define number in terms of classes. Take a class whose members are a knife and a fork, another class whose members are a husband and a wife, another class whose members are a cow and a bull. They are all classes of couples or pairs. This provides a way of defining the number 2. 2 is the class of all classes of couples. Likewise, the number 3 is the class of all classes of triples. The class containing all the classes like this, a class containing a knife, a fork, and a spoon, another class containing a mother, her husband, and a son, another class containing a cow, another a cow and a bull, and so on. This can be repeated for all numbers. A little more precisely, the number of class is the class of all those classes that are similar to it, where similar is the technical term set in theory stating that a one-to-one relationship obtains between the members of the classes in question. Despite appearances, this is not the paradox in question, though it looks circular, for the concepts of pairs, triples, quadruples, and so forth do not contain the concept of number. A waiter who cannot count can nevertheless know to put the triple of knife, fork, and spoon at each place in a table setting. Now, however paradox looms, to prepare for it, consider this related paradox. There is a barber in a village who shaves the men, all the men and only these men who do not shave themselves. Does he shave himself or not? If he does, he doesn't. And if he doesn't, he does. For obvious reasons, this is called the Barber paradox. Russell's paradox is this. Consider the fact that some classes are members of themselves and some are not. The class of all classes is obviously a member of itself, for it is a class, but the class of men is equally obviously not itself a man. Now, what of the class of all those classes which are not members of themselves? If it is a member of itself, then it is not a member of itself. And if it is not a member of itself, then it is a member of itself. The fact that the concept of classes can yield a contradiction is fatal for any system built upon its use, although the details of how this created problems for Freya's and Russell's endeavors are complex. This sketch is enough to indicate why it wrecked Freya's hopes and why it obliged Russell to seek various ad hoc and in the end unsatisfactory ways around it, chiefly by means of a theory of types, which sought to order classes into a hierarchy such that, speaking very schematically, only classes of a lower type can be members of classes of a higher type. Without a means of circumventing the paradox, Russell could not have proceeded with his logicist program. The devices he proposed, the theory of types, and two controversial axioms, eventually allowed him and his collaborator, Alfred North Whitehead, to complete the enormous Principia Mathematica, published in 3 volumes respectively in 1910, 1912, and 1913. The expense of printing the volumes with their hundreds of pages of logical symbols was so great that Russell and Whitehead had to supplement the cost out of their own pockets. The huge manuscript was wheeled to the offices of the Cambridge University Press in a perambulator. Principia Mathematica has been described as one of the 3 most important works of logic ever, the other 2 being Aristotle's Organon and Freya's Grundgesetze der Arithmetik. Okay, that is the judgment of the author of the related entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Okay, one reason offered is that the notation developed by Whitehead and Russell made logic greatly more effective and accessible as a tool, and revealed far more of its possibilities and uses. This opened the way to significant further developments in logic and philosophy, some of them developed by Russell himself. And so we said that the 3 most important works of logic are those of Aristotle, those of Freya, and those of Alfred North Whitehead and Russell. Other opinions about Principia Mathematica, while recognizing its philosophical fruitfulness, have not been so complimentary. The brilliant Austrian logician Kurt Gödel wrote of it, quote, "It is to be regretted that this first comprehensive and thoroughgoing presentation of a mathematical logic and the derivation of mathematics from it is so greatly lacking in formal precision in the foundations that it presents in this respect a considerable step backwards as compared with Freya. What is missing above all is a precise statement of the syntax of the formalism." End quote. Although true, this judgment is harsh. Without the advances made by Principia Mathematica itself, it would have been less easy to see what is required for a fully precise formal account of the foundations. Among the significant outcomes of this work was Russell's own philosophical endeavors in the long remainder of his life. Released from his labors on the big book, he turned his attention to a question which was central to almost everything he did in philosophy thereafter: the question of how science is derived from experience. Note that this is not the same as the question of how or whether science is justified by experience. It is not an effort to refute skepticism about the possibility of scientific knowledge. Instead, Russell wishes to explain the foundations of knowledge in empirical experience, just as Locke, Hume, and Mill, in their different ways, had tried to do. And for him, the paradigm of knowledge was science. He remained consistent in pursuing this aim throughout, and through his strategies for doing so changed a number of times, and his latter views involved significant compromises. At the outset, Russell's endeavor took the form of showing how the fundamental concepts of physics, which in 1912, when his Problems of Philosophy was published, were taken to be space, time, causality, and matter, are exhaustively verified by observation and experiment. By this time of his last attempt at the task, in Human Knowledge in 1948, physics had dispensed with causality and matter, space-time had replaced space and time, and Russell had come to accept what he had once emphatically rejected as Kant's Ptolemaic counter-revolution against scientific objectivity by putting the human mind back at the center of the phenomenal universe, namely that there are ineliminable a priori aspects to any account of how science arises from experience. This late shift in his thinking was a significant one for Russell because it meant abandoning his early pure form of empiricist commitment to the idea that sense experience is the foundation of knowledge. He had distinguished knowledge by description from knowledge by acquaintance, the former, knowledge by description, being derived from the latter, knowledge by acquaintance, and the latter consisting in direct cognitive contact with something. We have acquaintance with anything of which we are directly aware without the intermediary of any process of inference or any knowledge of truth. Knowledge by description, in contrast, is knowledge that is indirect, its justification resting on being ultimately inferred from acquaintance. For example, my knowledge that Everest is the highest mountain is indirect, but ultimately rests on the fact that there is knowledge by acquaintance, not necessarily mine, of what provides the ground for it. The technique Russell applied in earlier phases of this program was logical construction. He coined the term sense datum to denote a sense impression, the immediate object of awareness in experience, and proposed that physical objects be regarded as logical constructions out of actual and possible sense data. Think of perceiving a table. We visually experience shaped patches of color, which we regard as the tabletop and some of the legs, say, and we anticipate that if we gave ourselves the experience of doing such things as looking underneath and going around to the other side, we would have further sense data of a similar kind. The totality of the sense data we do and could have constitutes the table. The table is a logical construction out of them. This view, which in developments of it came to be known as phenomenalism. Phenomenalists included Rudolf Carnap and other logical positivists of the Vienna Circle, and A.J. Ayer is very similar to Berkeley's idealism, but is distinguished from it in a crucial way. The existence of an object currently unperceived by me, or any other finite being, is explained by Berkeley as consisting in its being perceived by a ubiquitous and omnipresent infinite spirit, or God. That is why the table in my room exists even when neither I nor anyone else is there to perceive it. The infinite spirit is perceiving it. And that's Berkeley, though. For a phenomenalist, the current unperceived existence of the table consists in the bare truth, this being a truth not explained or supported by anything else, of a counterfactual conditional statement that says, if I were in my room now, I would see the table. A conditional statement is an if-then statement. A counterfactual conditional is one whose if part states something that is not the case. It is contrary to the facts. Note that the verb in a counterfactual condition are in the subjunctive mood. If I were, then I would, thus showing that what is meant is if I were, but I am not, then I would. The reliance on barely true counterfactual conditionals is one of the main flaws with this approach. What makes such conditionals true? It is an unhelpful fact about conditionals in general for these purposes that they are anyway always true if the if part of them is false. This is a result purely of the logic of conditionality. So, how can an epistemological theory turn on this? Yet, without accepting the bare truth of counterfactuals, it is impossible to construct physical objects out of sense experience of them, because the sense experience of them is always partial and limited, so that the number of actual and possible sense data putatively constituting the object is such that one could never exhaustively reduce the object to experiences. The point can be put another way. To say that an object is a construction out of an actual and possible sense data is to say that statements about physical objects can be translated into statements about actual and possible sense experiences, but such translation can never be effected without remainder. There are always statements about objects which outrun statements about actual or possible experience. They include statements about other people's sense experiences, and statements in which reference is made to all places and times at which sense data constituting the object are or could be experienced. These points relate to a problem Russell refused to address because he took the same dismissive attitude to it as Locke had done, namely the problem of skeptical challenges to experience as a basis for knowledge. Other sense datum theorists, such as A.J. Ayer, who was a professor at Oxford, took this problem seriously and discovered that it defeats the phenomenalist project. For if phenomenalism were right, There would have to be, said Ayer, a deductive step from descriptions of physical reality to descriptions of possible, if not actual, appearances. And conversely, the occurrence of the sense data must be a sufficient condition for the existence of the physical object. There must be a deductive step from descriptions of actual or possible appearances to descriptions of physical reality. But as Ayer then adds, the decisive objection to phenomenalism is that neither of these requirements can be satisfied. In the preference to human knowledge, Russell observes that the terms belief, truth, knowledge, and perception all have in price common uses, which will require progressive clarification. The concepts of them have to be analyzed as a preparation for the synthesizing task of showing how the objects of belief and perception are, quote, logically constructed from experience. This was his methodology throughout, but at last, after various attempts to work out an account of how experience underlies science from our knowledge of the external world, that he wrote in 1914, through the analysis of mind in 1921, and the analysis of matter in 1927, and acceptance of a view called neutral monism, first put forward by William James, that mind and matter are expressions of a more fundamental single stuff, he came to the conclusion in Human Knowledge in 1948 that one can only get from experience to science by aid of a certain a priori principles. Either we know something a priori, he there wrote, or science is moonshine. But science is not moonshine. So we know something a priori. These a priori principles are what he calls postulates, and they embody beliefs about causality, the relative enduring of physical things, and the validity of inductive generalizations. He described them as instinctive beliefs, as Hume had similarly done, but in being known a priori while applying to how things actually are in the world, they are a synthetic a priori in Kant's sense, though Russell did not claim that they are transcendentally necessary. Indeed, the epistemology of human knowledge is fallibilist and tentative, a far cry from the search for certain foundations that had prompted his work in logic and mathematics, which he had said in the opening sentence of his Problems of Philosophy was what philosophy sought to discover. Perhaps the most important phase in the journey just described, from the point of view of its connection with both the early philosophy of Wittgenstein and the development of phenomenalism, was the logical atomist phase of Russell's thinking. He sometimes said logic is the essence of philosophy, to express his view that the surface forms of language are misleading and that it is therefore necessary to analyze its underlying structure using the perspicuous language of logic. This analysis demonstrated in the theory of descriptions, applying the same structural analysis to the world over which language ranges and showing the connections between the respective structures of world and language, offered Russell the account he sought. In his lectures on logical atomism, written while in prison in 1918, he argued as follows: the world consists of a plurality of things, each possessed of qualities and standing in relations to other things. A description of the world would require to be more than just a list of objects, but an explanation of their qualities and relations too. Things with their qualities and relations are constituents of facts, and facts are expressed by propositions. Propositions which express basic facts, that is, which simply assert that something has a certain quality or stands in a certain relation to some other thing, Russell called atomic propositions. When atomic propositions are combined together by means of the logical words and, or, and if, then they constitute complex or molecular propositions. These are exceedingly important because the possibility of inference depends on them. Finally, there are general propositions such as all men are mortal, and they require acceptance of some general principles in addition to the empirical evidence provided by acquaintance with the objects and properties referred to in atomic propositions. The atoms of the world arrived at by analysis are particular sense data, little patches of color or sounds, momentary things. And they are also properties like whiteness and relations like after or next to. One reason for calling them atoms is that in this context they are things which are both basic or fundamental and logically independent of each other. Analyzing complex symbols or propositions into the simple symbols out of which they are built, the atomic propositions enables us to make a direct connection between the terms in them and these atoms of experience. In a logically perfect language, the logic of Principia Mathematica, the ultimate components of the atomic propositions will correspond one-to-one with the atomic constituents of facts. In the ideal, each atomic object will have its own individual symbol corresponding to it. The atoms of the world are simples, things that are not further analyzable, and they are very short-lived. They are fleeting sense data, so that the complexes they constitute, the facts, are logical fictions, constructed out of them. We are acquainted with the atoms, everything else we know by description. The lectures on logical atomism sketch a program rather than offering a detailed metaphysics and epistemology, but even so they suggest difficulties, among them the following. The theory ambitiously tries to provide an empiricist account of meaning compromising views about knowledge, perception, and mind, and does so by assuming that there is a unique correct way of representing the underlying structure of language and logic. That is at least questionable. Russell includes among objects of direct acquaintance not just simple objects, but their qualities and relations, treating these as simples and as unanalyzable. Also, he cites color patches, an example of such atoms, but colors cannot be atomic because they are not logically independent of each other. Quite quickly, he had to row back on the idea that the symbols at the bottom of the logical structure are sense data, atoms of experience, saying that they cannot only be known inferentially as the limits of analysis. But then the ambition to connect physics with a body of descriptive knowledge to a ground in experience which supplies a direct connection between simple symbols and simple entities is derailed. Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus puts forward a version of this view in a much more rigorous, systematic, and spared-down way, and we will mention that later. But some of the ideas that Russell and Wittgenstein developed in their own ways had been discussed by them when Wittgenstein was Russell's pupil in Cambridge before the First World War. Russell never thought of himself as a moral philosopher, though he was certainly a moralist, not of a puritanical kind, quite the contrary, but in fact, he made genuine contributions to moral theory, anticipating emotivism, the idea that ethical judgments are distinguished expressions of how the judger feels about the matter in question, and error theory, the view associated mainly with J.L. Mackie, which we discussed in our lecture in my philosophy lectures on virtue ethics. So that because ethical judgments are not objective, they are false. So error theory is that because ethical judgments are not objective, they are false. So in light of the fact that Russell had empathetic views about what is right and wrong, the First World War was wrong. Nuclear weapons are bad. Smacking children is wrong. Hypocrisy is bad. Kindness and compassion are right. Peace is good. There is no straightforward link between his theory and practice. So Russell's popular writings on matters of society and morality were among the influences that helped to liberate at least the Western world from some of the excesses of Victorian moralism, and his popular writings on philosophy brought many to the subject. He became a sage, asked in his old age what message he would like to leave the world, and he rose to the challenge in his old-fashioned tones, saying in effect that he hoped rationality and peace would eventually overcome the follies to which humankind is so prone. King George and some others might have had reservations about Russell's private life, but taken in the round, there is no denying that he was a great man.